The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris stands as one of history's most infamous episodes of religious conflict, a tragic event that shocked the world and left an indelible mark on European history. Imagine a city gripped by fear, where religious tensions have reached a boiling point, and in the dead of night, violence erupts in the streets of Paris. This massacre, which took place in 1572, was not just a moment of horrific bloodshed, but a catastrophic turning point in the long-standing conflict between Catholics and Protestants in France. As the dawn of August 24th broke, thousands lay dead, and the future of a nation was forever altered. What led to such a brutal and sudden eruption of violence? How did this single event come to symbolize the destructive power of religious intolerance and the deep divisions that plagued Europe? This article delves into the origins, unfolding, and lasting impact of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, exploring why it remains the world's most famous religious conflict. Before we dive into this profound Bible world together, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more insights into biblical stories and their meanings. Don't forget to like and share our videos to spread the word and inspire others in their spiritual journey. How did the massacre take place? On the feast day of St. Paul the Apostle in 1572, in the magnificent capital of France, Paris, a terrible event occurred. In the early morning hours of August 24th, 1572, Paris awoke to one of the most devastating events in its history, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. What began as a wave of targeted violence quickly escalated into a citywide conflict, spreading fear and chaos throughout France. Thousands of lives were lost as Protestant Huguenots were attacked, leading to a series of tragic events that would have lasting repercussions on the nation's religious and political landscape. This conflict marked a turning point in the French Wars of Religion, leaving a deep scar on the collective memory of France. In the years leading up to the massacre, France was deeply divided between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants. The country had already endured several wars of religion, and tensions were high. King Charles IX, under the influence of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, sought to establish a fragile peace by marrying his sister, Margaret of Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a leading Huguenot. The marriage was intended to symbolize the reconciliation between the two religious factions, but in reality, it only served to heighten the tensions. Thousands of Huguenots, including many of their leaders, traveled to Paris for the wedding, despite the city being a stronghold of Catholicism. The atmosphere in Paris was tense. The presence of so many Huguenots in the capital was a source of unease for the Catholic majority. The tension reached a boiling point on August 22nd, 1572, when an assassination attempt was made on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent Huguenot leader. Although Coligny survived the attempt, the attack set off a chain of events that would lead to the massacre. The failed assassination attempt on Coligny sent shockwaves through both the Huguenot and Catholic communities. The Huguenots demanded justice, while the Catholics feared retaliation. Catherine de' Medici, who had long been wary of Coligny's influence over her son, saw an opportunity to eliminate the Huguenot leadership in one swift move. It is believed that she convinced King Charles IX that a preemptive strike against the Huguenots was necessary to prevent a Protestant uprising. On the night of August 23, 1572, King Charles IX gave the order to take action against the Huguenots. The decision was made to target the Huguenot leaders first, under the pretext of protecting the crown and the Catholic faith. However, what began as a calculated political maneuver quickly spiraled out of control. In the early hours of August 24, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, the violence began. Catholic soldiers and city guards, under orders from the king, stormed the homes of Huguenot leaders across Paris. Admiral Coligny was one of the first to be killed. His murder signaled the start of a wave of violence that would engulf the city. As word of the killing spread, the situation in Paris quickly deteriorated. What had been intended as a targeted operation against Huguenot leaders turned into a widespread attack on the entire Huguenot population of Paris. Mobs of Catholic citizens, fueled by religious fervor and years of pent-up animosity, took to the streets. They began targeting Huguenots indiscriminately, believing they were defending their faith and their city from heretics. The violence in Paris lasted for several days, and the killing spread to other parts of France. The massacres extended beyond the capital to cities such as Lyon, Toulouse, and Bordeaux, where local Catholic populations, emboldened by the events in Paris, took up arms against their Protestant neighbors. The role of the royal family in the massacre has been the subject of much debate among historians. While it is clear that King Charles IX and Catherine de' Medici were involved in the decision to target the Huguenots, the extent of their responsibility for the widespread violence that followed is less certain. King Charles IX, who was just 22 years old at the time, was reportedly plagued by guilt and doubt in the aftermath of the massacre. According to some accounts, he was deeply troubled by the bloodshed and is said to have exclaimed, "What have I done? God help me, I am lost." However, by then the violence had already spread beyond his control. Catherine de' Medici, often portrayed as the mastermind behind the massacre, likely saw the elimination of the Huguenot leaders as a means to secure her family's hold on power. However, it is doubtful that she anticipated the scale of the violence that would follow. The massacre may have begun as a political calculation, but it quickly turned into a tragedy of unprecedented proportions. As news of the massacre in Paris spread, similar outbreaks of violence occurred in other parts of France. In some cities, the local authorities organized attacks on the Huguenot population, while in others, Catholic mobs took matters into their own hands. The violence varied in intensity from region to region, but the overall impact was devastating for the Huguenot community. In places like Lyon, the massacre was particularly brutal. The city's Huguenots were rounded up and executed, often with little regard for their social standing or previous relationships with their Catholic neighbors. In Toulouse, the Huguenots who sought refuge in the city's fortified stronghold were besieged and ultimately forced to surrender. The subsequent executions further diminished the Huguenot presence in the city. The spread of violence to the provinces illustrated the deep-seated animosity between Catholics and Protestants in France. It also highlighted the inability of the crown to maintain control over its subjects in the face of religious passions. The massacre served to deepen the divide between the two communities, setting the stage for further conflict. Religious leaders on both sides played a significant role in the events leading up to and during the massacre. Catholic priests and preachers, who had long denounced the Huguenots as heretics, encouraged their congregations to take up arms against the Protestants. The rhetoric of religious war, which had been used to justify previous conflicts, was now used to legitimize the killing of thousands of innocent people. Some Catholic leaders, such as the Cardinal of Lorraine, are believed to have supported the massacre as a means of defending the Catholic faith. Their influence over the population, combined with the long-standing fear of Protestantism, helped to turn what might have been a localized act of violence into a nationwide tragedy. On the Protestant side, the massacre was seen as a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in the crown. The Huguenots believed that the marriage of Henry of Navarre to Margaret of Valois would bring about peace and greater religious tolerance. Instead, they found themselves the victims of a brutal campaign of violence. Protestant leaders, both in France and abroad, condemned the massacre and used it as a rallying cry for resistance. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre sent shockwaves across Europe. Protestant nations were horrified by the events in France, viewing the massacre as a stark example of Catholic intolerance and persecution. The massacre reinforced the fears of Protestants in England, the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe, who saw it as evidence that their Catholic neighbors could not be trusted. In England, Queen Elizabeth I was particularly shaken by the news of the massacre. The violence against Protestants in France reminded her of the threats posed by Catholic forces within her kingdom. The massacre hardened her resolve to support Protestant causes across Europe, leading to increased tensions with Catholic Spain and the papacy. The massacre also had a profound impact on the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. The Dutch Protestants, who were already engaged in a struggle for independence from Catholic Spain, were further motivated by the events in France. The massacre served as a reminder of the dangers of Catholic rule, strengthening the resolve of the Dutch to continue their fight for freedom. In contrast, Catholic powers such as Spain and the Papal States viewed the massacre with approval. Pope Gregory XIII, who had long been concerned about the spread of Protestantism in France, celebrated the massacre as a victory for the Catholic Church. He ordered a Te Deum to be sung in Rome to commemorate the event, and even issued a medal to mark the occasion. However, this papal endorsement only served to further alienate Protestant nations and deepen the religious divide in Europe. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had far-reaching consequences for France and Europe as a whole. In the immediate aftermath, the massacre destroyed the fragile peace that had been established between Catholics and Protestants. The Huguenot community was decimated, with many of its leaders killed or forced into exile. Those who remained in France were left distrustful of the crown and determined to continue their struggle for religious freedom. The massacre also had a lasting impact on the French wars of religion. The conflict, which had already been raging for a decade, became even more brutal and protracted in the years that followed. Both sides committed further atrocities, and the hope of a peaceful resolution to the conflict seemed more distant than ever. For the French monarchy, the massacre represented a significant blow to its legitimacy. King Charles IX, who had hoped to strengthen his authority through the elimination of the Huguenot leadership, instead found himself increasingly isolated and mistrusted. The massacre weakened the crown's ability to mediate between the two religious factions, contributing to the eventual rise of absolutism under later French kings. On a broader scale, the massacre deepened the religious divide in Europe and set the stage for further conflicts, including the 30 Years' War. The violence of St. Bartholomew's Day served as a grim reminder of the dangers of religious intolerance and the need for greater tolerance and understanding in a divided society. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not a sudden eruption of violence, but the culmination of years of escalating religious tension in France. The start of the massacre can be traced to familial and religious origins. King Charles IX of France was Catherine's second son to sit on the French throne after the death of her husband in 1559. Charles succeeded her eldest son, Francis II, whose reign was a short and unsuccessful one before Francis died in 1560. His sickly demeanor and weak will had made him susceptible to manipulation from the powerful Guise family. Roman Catholics who wanted to dilute the political power of the rival Huguenots, French Protestants. In 1572, Catherine was seeing another son fall prey to outside influence, this time in the opposite direction. One of Charles's key advisors was Admiral Gaspard I de Coligny, a Huguenot who supported the war against Spain as a way to prevent the resumption of civil war in France between Huguenots and Catholics. Charles was expected to approve the plan that summer, starting one war to prevent another. Though her exact actions are difficult to track, Catherine likely took matters into her own hands. She gave her approval to a plot hatched by the House of Guise to assassinate Coligny, whom they held responsible for the murder of François de Guise in 1563. The assassination was planned for the week of her daughter Margaret's wedding to the Huguenot Henry of Navarre, an occasion that brought Huguenot nobility from across France into Paris. 4 days after the wedding ceremony, the assassination was attempted, but it failed. Coligny was merely wounded, and the Huguenot nobility, conveniently on the scene, demanded answers. Charles IX promised to investigate. The seeds of conflict were sown in the early 16th century with the rise of the Protestant Reformation, which challenged the authority of the Catholic Church and spread rapidly across Europe. In France, the Protestant movement, known as Huguenotism, gained significant traction, particularly among the nobility and educated classes. The Huguenots, who adhered to Calvinist doctrine, sought religious freedom and political influence, which threatened the Catholic hegemony in France. As Protestantism spread, the French Catholic majority, supported by the monarchy and the powerful Catholic Church, viewed the Huguenots as heretics and a destabilizing force. This deep-seated religious hatred led to a series of conflicts known as the French Wars of Religion, which raged intermittently from 1562 to 1598. These wars were marked by brutal battles, massacres, and a general atmosphere of distrust and hostility between the two religious factions. By the early 1570s, the situation had become increasingly volatile. The Huguenots had grown in numbers and influence, particularly in regions like the south of France, where they controlled several fortified cities. The Catholic majority, led by the powerful Guise family and supported by the monarchy, was determined to suppress what they saw as a dangerous heresy that threatened the unity of the kingdom. The French crown, under King Charles IX and heavily influenced by his mother, Catherine de' Medici, sought to maintain control over a fracturing nation, but their attempts to balance the interests of both Catholics and Protestants only fueled further conflict. To bring peace and stability to the fractured kingdom, Catherine de' Medici orchestrated the marriage of her daughter, Margaret of Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a prominent Huguenot leader, and future King Henry IV of France. This marriage was intended to be a symbolic union that would bridge the religious divide and create a powerful alliance between the Catholic and Protestant factions. The wedding, which took place in Paris in August 1572, brought many Huguenot leaders to the capital, where they gathered in large numbers to celebrate what was hoped to be the beginning of a new era of peace. However, the marriage did not have the desired effect. Instead of uniting the two sides, It exacerbated the underlying tensions. The Catholic factions, particularly the ultra-Catholic Guise family, were deeply opposed to the marriage and viewed it as a threat to their influence and the Catholic faith. The presence of so many Huguenot leaders in Paris, including Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the de facto leader of the Protestant faction, further heightened the sense of unease among the Catholic elite. The situation reached a breaking point on August 22, 1572, just 2 days after the royal wedding, when Admiral Coligny was shot and wounded in an assassination attempt. Coligny was a key figure in the Protestant movement and a close advisor to King Charles IX, which made him a significant target for the Catholic hardliners. Although Coligny survived the attempt on his life, the incident sent shockwaves through both the Protestant and Catholic camps. The Huguenots, already on edge due to their precarious position in a predominantly Catholic city, demanded justice and suspected that the attempt on Coligny's life was part of a larger Catholic plot to eliminate their leadership. The Catholic faction, on the other hand, feared retaliation and the possibility of a Protestant uprising. The atmosphere in Paris became increasingly tense, with both sides preparing for the worst. In the wake of the assassination attempt, the royal court was thrown into a state of panic. Catherine de' Medici, fearful of the Huguenot reaction and the potential for a full-blown civil war, made the fateful decision to eliminate the Protestant leaders gathered in Paris. On the night of August 23rd to 24th, 1572, just hours before the feast day of St. Bartholomew, orders were given to strike. The timing of the massacre on the eve of St. Bartholomew's feast day is significant. St. Bartholomew, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, was traditionally revered as a martyr in the Catholic Church. His feast day, August 24th, was a solemn occasion marked by reflection on the sacrifices of the early Christian martyrs. The massacre, which unfolded in the early hours of this holy day, was seen by many as a grim parallel to the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, where the Huguenots were cast in the role of the martyrs, suffering at the hands of their oppressors. A combination of religious zeal, political expediency, and fear drove the decision to carry out the massacre. For the Catholic leadership, the presence of so many Huguenot leaders in Paris was both an opportunity and a threat. Eliminating the Protestant leadership was seen as a way to neutralize the Huguenot threat and reassert Catholic dominance in France. At the same time, the fear of Protestant retaliation and the potential for civil war weighed heavily on the minds of Catherine de' Medici and her advisors. The massacre itself, however, quickly spiraled out of control. What began as a targeted operation against Huguenot leaders soon turned into a citywide orgy of violence. Catholic mobs, fueled by religious fervor and hatred, took to the streets, attacking Huguenots indiscriminately. Over the next few days, the violence spread beyond Paris to other parts of France, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Huguenots and deepening the religious divide. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had profound and lasting effects on France and the wider European world. Soon after, the massacre shattered all hopes of reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants in France. The violence further deepened the divide between the two sides, leading to a period of instability and conflict that lasted for decades. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had profound and lasting effects on France and the wider European world. In the immediate aftermath, the massacre shattered any hopes for reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants in France. The violence further entrenched the divisions between the two sides, leading to a prolonged period of instability and conflict that would continue for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, France was plunged into chaos. The massacre, which initially targeted Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris for the wedding of Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre, quickly escalated into widespread violence against Protestants. The killing spread from Paris to other cities, including Lyon, Bordeaux, and Toulouse, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Huguenots. Estimates of the death toll vary, with some historians suggesting that as many as 10,000 to 30,000 Protestants were killed in the days and weeks following the massacre. The violence left the Huguenot community decimated and demoralized. Many Protestant leaders were either killed or forced into hiding, leaving the Huguenot movement leaderless and disorganized. The massacre also created a wave of refugees, as thousands of Huguenots fled France to seek safety in Protestant-friendly countries such as England, the Dutch Republic, and Switzerland. These refugees brought with them stories of the atrocities they had witnessed, further fueling anti-Catholic sentiment in Protestant regions. The massacre also had significant political ramifications. The French monarchy, particularly King Charles IX and his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who were widely believed to have sanctioned the massacre, faced severe criticism both domestically and internationally. The monarchy's role in the massacre damaged its legitimacy and authority, particularly among the Huguenots, who had previously looked to the crown for protection and support. King Charles IX, who had been struggling to maintain control over a divided kingdom, found himself increasingly isolated. The massacre undermined his efforts to present himself as a unifying figure and instead painted him as a ruler who had betrayed his subjects. This loss of trust had long-term consequences for the monarchy, contributing to the erosion of royal authority and the eventual rise of absolutism under later French kings, particularly Louis XIV. Internationally, the massacre was condemned by Protestant nations and celebrated by Catholic powers. In Protestant England, the massacre was seen as a stark example of Catholic tyranny and a warning of what could happen if Catholicism regained power. Queen Elizabeth I, who had been cautious in her dealings with France, became more openly hostile to the French crown and strengthened her support for Protestant causes across Europe. In contrast, Catholic powers such as Spain and the papacy viewed the massacre as a victory for Catholicism. Pope Gregory XIII, who had been concerned about the spread of Protestantism in France, ordered a Te Deum to be sung in celebration of the massacre and commissioned a commemorative medal to mark the event. However, this papal endorsement further alienated Protestant nations and deepened the religious divide in Europe. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre marked a turning point in the French Wars of Religion, a series of conflicts that had already been raging for a decade. The massacre effectively ended any hopes of peaceful coexistence between Catholics and Protestants in France. The fragile peace that had been brokered by the Edict of St. Germain in 1570, which granted limited religious freedoms to the Huguenots, was shattered, and the country descended into a renewed phase of civil war. In the years following the massacre, the Huguenots adopted a more militant stance, recognizing that they could no longer rely on the crown for protection. They fortified their strongholds in southern France and launched a series of military campaigns against Catholic forces. The wars became increasingly brutal, with both sides committing atrocities and showing little mercy to their enemies. The massacre also had a lasting psychological impact on both Catholics and Protestants in France. For Catholics, the massacre was often justified as a necessary measure to protect the Catholic faith and the unity of the kingdom. However, for Protestants, the massacre became a symbol of Catholic treachery and a rallying cry for resistance. The memory of the massacre fueled anti-Catholic sentiment for generations and was invoked by Protestant leaders as a justification for continued armed struggle. The wars of religion continued for more than 2 decades after the massacre, culminating in the ascension of Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, to the French throne as King Henry IV in 1589. Henry's conversion to Catholicism in 1593, famously encapsulated in the phrase "Paris is worth a mass," was a pragmatic decision aimed at securing his rule and ending the religious wars. However, the conflict did not truly end until the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted significant religious freedoms to the Huguenots and brought a measure of peace to the kingdom. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had repercussions beyond France, influencing the broader religious conflicts that would engulf Europe in the decades to come. The massacre was seen as a precursor to the 30 Years' War 1618 to 1648, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history, which pitted Catholic and Protestant states against each other in a struggle for political and religious dominance. The massacre's legacy of religious violence and intolerance contributed to the polarization of Europe along confessional lines. Protestant nations, fearing a similar fate, became more resolute in their opposition to Catholic powers, while Catholic states, emboldened by the massacre, sought to expand their influence. This polarization set the stage for the 30 Years' War, which would devastate much of Europe and reshape the continent's political and religious landscape. The massacre also had a significant impact on European culture and intellectual life. In France, the massacre and the subsequent wars of religion created a sense of disillusionment and despair among many intellectuals and artists. The violence and cruelty of the period were reflected in the literature and art of the time, which often depicted scenes of suffering and martyrdom. One of the most notable responses to the massacre was the rise of the Politique movement, a group of moderate Catholics and Protestants who argued for a separation of religion and politics and sought to end the cycle of religious violence. The Politiques, who included figures such as Michel de Montaigne and Jean Bodin, advocated for religious tolerance and the rule of law as the foundation for a stable and peaceful society. Their ideas would later influence the development of secularism and the Enlightenment. The massacre also had a lasting impact on the Protestant Reformation. The event was used by Protestant leaders to highlight the dangers of Catholicism and to rally support for the Protestant cause. In England, the massacre was depicted as a stark warning of what could happen if Catholicism were allowed to regain power. The event was invoked in anti-Catholic propaganda for centuries, particularly during times of religious tension, such as the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. The religious legacy of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is perhaps the most enduring. The massacre deepened the religious divide in France and across Europe, contributing to a legacy of sectarian violence and intolerance that would persist for centuries. The memory of the massacre was kept alive by both Catholics and Protestants, each of whom interpreted the event in ways that reinforced their own religious identity and worldview. For Catholics, the massacre was often seen as a necessary defense of the faith against heresy, while for Protestants it was a symbol of Catholic cruelty and oppression. This polarization of memory contributed to the entrenchment of religious identities and the persistence of religious conflict in Europe. The massacre also had a profound impact on the development of religious tolerance. The horror of the event and the subsequent wars of religion led many to question the wisdom of religious persecution and to advocate for greater religious freedom. The massacre and its aftermath helped to lay the groundwork for the later development of ideas about religious tolerance and the separation of church and state. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in French history. It is remembered not only for the scale of violence, but also for the way it symbolizes the dangers of religious fanaticism and intolerance. The massacre serves as a reminder of the destructive power of hatred and the importance of fighting for peace and reconciliation in the face of deep divisions. In the centuries since the massacre, it has been the subject of numerous historical studies and literary and artistic works. These depictions kept the memory of the massacre alive, ensuring that its lessons were not forgotten. The massacre continues to be a powerful symbol of the dangers of religious conflict and the need for tolerance and understanding in a divided world. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris was more than just a tragic event, it was a turning point in the history of religious conflict in Europe. The massacre laid bare the destructive power of intolerance and the devastating consequences of religious division. The violence that erupted on that fateful night in 1572 left thousands dead and set the stage for decades of further conflict, not just in France but across Europe. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, it serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of fanaticism and the importance of seeking peace and understanding in a world often divided by belief. The legacy of the massacre continues to resonate, reminding us of the need for tolerance, dialogue, and reconciliation in the face of our deepest differences. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, with its roots in deep-seated religious tensions and intolerance, stands in stark contrast to the teachings of forgiveness and compassion found throughout the Bible. The New Testament, particularly, emphasizes the importance of love, mercy, and forgiveness, which are central to Christian doctrine. Jesus' teachings on forgiveness. Jesus consistently taught his followers to forgive others, even in the face of betrayal and harm. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus instructs Peter to forgive 70 times 7 times Matthew 18:21-22, emphasizing the boundless nature of forgiveness. This principle stands in direct opposition to the cycle of revenge and violence that characterized the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18:23-35. Jesus tells the parable of a servant who, after being forgiven a great debt by his master, refuses to forgive a fellow servant a much smaller debt. The master, angered by the servant's lack of mercy, revokes his forgiveness. This story illustrates the hypocrisy of demanding mercy for oneself while refusing to extend it to others. The massacre in Paris is a chilling reminder of what happens when mercy and forgiveness are abandoned in favor of retribution and hatred. The Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches the value of turning the other cheek, loving one's enemies, and praying for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:38-44. These teachings advocate for a radical form of love and forgiveness that seeks reconciliation rather than retribution. The violence of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre highlights the tragic consequences when such teachings are ignored and hatred is allowed to fester. The story of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10:25-37, is another powerful example of biblical teachings on compassion and mercy. In this story, a Samaritan, who would have been seen as an enemy by the Jews, shows kindness to a wounded man when others pass by. The parable challenges believers to show love and kindness to all people, regardless of their background or beliefs. The events of the massacre, driven by religious division, are a stark departure from this message of universal compassion. Jesus' crucifixion, perhaps the most profound example of forgiveness in the Bible, is found in Jesus' own actions on the cross. As he was being crucified, Jesus prayed for those who were executing him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," Luke 23:30-34. This act of forgiveness, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, underscores the depth of Jesus' commitment to mercy and love. The massacre, where forgiveness was overshadowed by vengeance, serves as a reminder of the power and importance of these teachings. In linking the events of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre to these biblical teachings, we are reminded of the critical need for forgiveness and compassion in resolving conflicts. The massacre stands as a historical lesson in the destructive potential of intolerance, and a call to live by the principles of mercy and understanding that are at the heart of the Christian faith. These teachings offer a pathway to peace and reconciliation, even in the most difficult and divided times, and serve as a timeless antidote to the kind of violence and hatred that led to the tragedy in Paris.